Well, thank y'all so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to talking about this topic that I've continued to learn and grow with over the last couple of years as I've been seeing clients in my private practice in Spartanburg. I have a practice called North Grove Counseling Associates, and it is at North Grove Medical Park, which is right behind Milliken in Spartanburg, right off of Business 85. And I'm there about 4 days a week. And there's another therapist in there with me who sees the kids, and then I see high school age and up, so teens, individuals, and couples. But I've noticed over the last couple of years that a lot of people have been coming in with issues related to intrusive, unwanted thoughts. And so what I want to do today is just break that down a little bit for you guys. There's several different categories that this plays out. And you have a handout, but I don't want you to feel like you need to be following along in that. You can just kind of stick that in your notes. And it's really basically the outline of my talk today so that you don't feel like you have to write everything down that I'm talking about, just to be able to have references for that later. But there's 4 different categories that I've kind of put these intrusive thoughts into, and some of these things are related to actual disorders that you would find in the DSM for mental health disorders, and some of them are just tendencies that everyday people have, and some of them are season of life related. The first one is I want to talk about is just having a general tendency or propensity towards irrational thoughts. And I think that you guys may have received an article called Wicked Thoughts that came out of Psychology Today a couple of years ago that talks about this. And when I came across this article, it was something that I had been seeing with clients and was really interested to read and realize that there's been research done around this. And that article talked about that a study that showed that out of a 16-hour day, the participants had about 500 intrusive thoughts, with 18% falling in the unacceptable, uncomfortable, bad category. So maybe just, not thinking something not nice about somebody or something like that. But 13% were ugly, out of character, or shocking. Thoughts about, killing yourself or hurting someone else or acting out sexually or something like that. It's a lot of people are having these types of things. 91% of men and 84% of women have had murderous thoughts. If you've been there, if you've experienced that, it's interesting. I've talked to some people and said, do you ever think about jumping off a bridge or driving your car into a tree? And some people are like, yes. And other people are like, no, who thinks that way? And so if you have had thoughts like that and, you've been brave enough to ask if anybody else has and gotten the reaction that, what kind of person are you? Then it kind of causes you to say, oh, something must be wrong with me. But actually, it's not necessarily true. So we're going to talk more about examples of that in a little bit. But the next category would be OCD-related thoughts. So obsessive-compulsive disorder is something that kind of gets misunderstood. A lot of times people use OCD to describe somebody who's basically a type A personality. And that's not true. True OCD is somebody who has obsessions, which are unwanted and repeated thoughts, feelings, or images and sensations. And those obsessions cause them distress. So a classic example would be someone's obsession might be that someone is trying to harm me and my family. Someone could try to get in the house and hurt us. So if they're truly obsessed with that, the compulsion is the behavior or the mental act in response to these thoughts or obsessions, is what they do to alleviate some of that tension, some of that anxiety around the thing that they're obsessed with. So they might feel like, I've got to check all the doors in the house every night before I go to bed because I'm responsible for keeping my family safe. And if I don't check a door and leave one open, someone could get in and then it will be on me. And so not only do they check it one time, but they might check it 49 times. One client that I had, they had to check it 49 times. And what if if I didn't check it, if I just checked it at 48, that could be the time that it wasn't right, and the thing is that, these are often intelligent people, and they know that their thoughts are irrational, but they continue to do this anyway because it provides temporary relief. And so they hide these behaviors because they don't want other people to think that they're crazy, and they also don't want people to ask them to stop doing it because it would cause them to feel anxious to not do it. So they are really good at protecting or hiding these things. And it's likely that you know people who have these types of issues. And so the thing about OCD is that people with OCD are not, they aren't crazy, And crazy is not a very popular word in mental health, but basically someone who is, crazy is, like I was saying, is not kosher, but someone who fits in that category would be more someone who is having delusional thoughts. And they're saying, someone's put this in my head, someone's following me, this voice told me. That is delusional. People with OCD are not delusional. They know that this is not a rational thought, but it's still causing them anxiety. So that's that category. Then there's scrupulosity. And scrupulosity is a term that I just learned a couple of years ago. Bill and I were talking about this earlier, but I was in a supervision group with some other therapists, and this came up. And it's basically OCD around religious or moral obsessions. And so it's somebody, and some of you may have actually encountered someone with this and you didn't even realize it, and you were just probably ready to hit your head up against the wall, because people with scrupulosity are obsessed with the fact that maybe they're not really saved, or maybe they have done the cardinal sin, or maybe something related to that. So it could be excessive concerns about blasphemy, having committed a sin, behaving morally, purity, going to hell, death, or loss of impulse control. Those are all examples of that. And so the compulsions that they have around this is excessive confession, seeking of reassurance of salvation from religious leaders or mentors, repeated cleansing, purifying rituals, things like saying, people who are Catholic struggle with this a lot, and they might say a certain number of Hail Marys, or those types of things. Avoidance of services where impure thoughts might inappropriately arise. So they might feel like, when I'm at church or when I'm at Mass, I start to think about sex, or I start to think about something inappropriate, and so that would be sin, and then I'm sinning in God's house, and so it just spirals from there, snowballs. And so I have had clients who struggle with this and didn't realize that it was scrupulosity at first, even though I knew about scrupulosity, because I think, we're having this deep theological discussion, and I'm getting this great opportunity to talk to them about their faith and help them understand, the truth and the power behind the gospel. But when I find myself having the same type of conversation week after week, month after month with the same person, and I realize something's not right here. Something's not clicking. They're not getting to that aha moment where they're like, I can rest in the assurance of my salvation. And so that's when you realize that scrupulosity is what's going on. Hopefully before then you realize that, but you can easily get sucked in, because they're not telling you that they have this problem, and they're not really wanting you to notice that it's a problem, because they don't want you to tell them to stop doing these behaviors, because that would take away their kind of pressure valve release for the anxiety. So we'll talk some more about that again in a minute. But the fourth category is postpartum depression. And so this is when women, after having a baby, often can have disturbing thoughts that you've never had before, scary thoughts that make you wonder whether you aren't the person that you thought you were, fly into your head unwanted. They aren't right, that this isn't real, but they terrify you and they won't go away. The thought often starts with the words, what if? What if I drop my baby? What if, maybe they're in the kitchen and they see the knives on the knife mag. What if I was to stab my baby? What if I, and sleep deprivation definitely, makes this worse. But it's not just that. It's bigger than sleep deprivation. So a lot of times people will say, oh, they just need a good night's rest, or they just need this or the other, but it continues. And so they may not want to be alone with their baby as a result of this. They avoid certain things like stairs or being in the kitchen with dangerous objects or things like that. They may feel the need to check things constantly, like locking the door, locking the car, turning off the oven, going in constantly in the baby's room. Is she still breathing? Those types of things. And, it can be very frustrating and stressful for the other members of the family. So those are kind of those four main categories. And I wanted to share a couple of examples from my private practice of clients that I've seen where some of these things, and this is even just in the last 4 years, individuals with unwanted thoughts about harming or abusing a child, mothers who really love their kids but come in, great mothers, and come in saying, I think about hurting my child. What kind of person am I? Causes them, one person who is a teacher and a mom, having those kind of thoughts. Another person who had those thoughts so bad that they went to the hospital because they were so worried about it and wanted to protect themselves from doing it. And even though I had kind of explained to them that this is OCD related, these are irrational thoughts. People who are worried about hurting someone are not going to hurt someone. When you think about people in jail who've killed someone, they weren't walking around every day going, oh gosh, I just hope I didn't shoot somebody with this gun, and I hope I don't hurt other people. They don't care. They do it because it doesn't bother them. And so this is a totally different thing. And that person, when they went to the hospital, DSS actually took their child. And so it was unnecessary, for that to get to that place. But they, all these policies in place at the hospital and stuff like that. So an individual who has thoughts about intentionally causing a wreck or jumping off a bridge or something like that. So a client who would drive down the road, and anytime she had this thought, what if I just swerved over and hit a car in oncoming traffic? To protect themselves and other cars, the minute they would have that thought, they'd pull over on the side of the road and sit there for 10 or 15 minutes to try to get to a point where that thought passed. Well, of course, that made them late everywhere they went, and it was really frustrating and distressing, and while they'd be sitting there, they're like, what kind of person am I? So it's causing a lot of problems. Individuals who have thoughts that they could stab themselves in the eye. It's interesting because I had a client who had this repeated thought that if I was holding a pen or a pencil or a knife or something, like, what if I just stab myself in the eye? And then that's in the introduction of this book on Can Christianity Cure Obsessive Compulsive Disorder? And I read that section to them, and they were like, oh, I'm not alone. But that's one example. Individuals who fear they will act out in a homosexual or extramarital sexual act. And, I've had a number of people who say, I really do not, I don't think that I have a bent towards homosexuality, but I do think about acting out, sexually with someone of the same sex, so maybe I am a homosexual and I don't even know it. Maybe this is how it all begins, like all this kind of stuff. And so those thoughts start to snowball and build, and somebody who's not really even struggling with same-sex attraction has convinced themselves that maybe they're a closet homosexual. And so that begins to bring a lot of anxiety, especially if they're a believer. What does that mean about my faith, and all this kind of stuff. So that can definitely escalate. What if I blurt out in public and embarrass myself? One client who wouldn't eat out in public because whenever he would have the sensation that he was going to burp, he thought that maybe there was vomit underneath that, and that if he burped in public, he would actually throw up in front of everybody, and it was illogical, it was not true, but, it kept them from eating around anybody else, which obviously is pretty isolating. What if certain areas of my house are contaminated and will cause me or someone in my family to become sick? A young mom who was very concerned that, as her little baby was walking around the house and touching everything, she's going to be contaminated. And so constantly sterilizing everything in the house, constantly washing the child's hands, it was wearing everybody out in the family. What if someone breaks into my home? I kind of already talked about that one. Another one, a client one time, and this is actually pretty common for people with OCD to worry that what if I actually ran over somebody on the way to work? And so the idea is kind of crazy for us to think about how could you run over someone and not notice, but there is a belief that what if I wasn't paying attention? What if I looked away? What if I left somebody on the side of the road so they would go back and retrace their steps and look for somebody on the side of the road? No, that's definitely in the OCD category. So some of these examples that I just shared are, obsessive, compulsive in nature, and some of them are just irrational thoughts. But you can kind of see those are all real examples that I've talked to people about in the last 4 years. So a lot of people are having these thoughts, more than you would think. The distress comes not just from the fear of the act itself, but the meaning that people make of this, of the thought. So, for example, if I have thoughts like this, then perhaps I am a child molester, a murderer, a suicidal person, a homosexual, an adulterer, a crazy, risk to society. And so that can really bring on, when it gets into identity, it really starts to impact people in a big way, because it's not just this passing thought, but there's the belief that, when I go for a walk over the bridge and I think about jumping off, what would it be like to just jump over that bridge and then I'd be dead? It's like, if the person really continues to think about that as, well, if I jumped off that bridge, if I think about jumping off the bridge today when I'm having a great day and I'm doing fine, then what happens if, I'm having a bad day? What happens if my spouse just passed away, or I lost one of my kids, or we went bankrupt? What if I had that thought then? Then I might act on it. And then if I acted on it, then maybe this is how it all begins, with suicide. Maybe I am a potential suicide candidate. Maybe everyone in my family is going to have to deal with suicide. And it's like, whoa, we've got from this passing thought to I'm a suicidal person, and I can't let anybody know, because if anybody knew that I was suicidal, then they would have to report it, and then I would get committed, and, so I've got to keep this all under the wraps, and so you can see how this builds for people. So as a result, people start to take unnecessary precautions. They ruminate on those thoughts like I was just doing. They shame themselves, to try to get themselves to stop doing this. What kind of person are you for doing this? You cannot think this way. You're bad for thinking this way. They isolate from others, including children and significant others. So if the thought is, what if I was to molest my child? They might say, well, I'm not going to bathe them. I'm not going to put them to bed because I don't want to be in the room with them when it's time for bed alone. I'm not going to be left alone with them. I'm not going to touch them affectionately. And all of a sudden, these irrational thoughts are causing someone to really neglect their child. And maybe they're meeting their basic needs, but the bonding between the parent and the child is really suffering. And that child is wondering, why doesn't my mom touch me? Why won't she bathe me? And it's causing a lot of stress for the spouse too. Now they're having to take on all of this stuff. So the other thing is avoiding people and places that trigger these thoughts. Just like the client who was worried about throwing up in public. So couldn't go to dinner with his family anytime they went out to eat, had to stay home alone. Couldn't drive a far distance because I might have to pull over every few minutes, if I have that thought that I'm going to run into somebody, so I can only go really short distances. So it really begins to impact people's daily life. So this results in wasted time, negative self-worth, anxiety and depression. A lot of anxiety comes out of this. Sometimes people come in to see me and the anxiety is the presenting problem. But as we begin to talk about things and I've learned to kind of start to assess for OCD and some of these obsessive thoughts when this is going on, and realize that it's not anxiety, it's OCD that they're struggling with, or unwanted thoughts that they're struggling with. And once we're able to address that, the anxiety goes away. Difficulty sleeping, especially falling asleep, because a lot of people find that they ruminate a lot as they're lying in bed trying to fall asleep, trying to toss this over in their mind. One client, a really sweet young teen, was at nighttime she would start to have what she called suicidal thoughts, but really as we boiled it down, we realized that she was just tired from a day of having these unwanted thoughts. And when she thought about another day of doing it again tomorrow, and another day that after that, it was just so exhausting and overwhelming that she was just like, oh, I wish God would just like take me in my sleep. I wish I could just go to sleep and never wake up. And then she was like, am I suicidal and all this stuff? And it wasn't that. She was just tired of struggling with this. It was weary. So treatment. This is where you guys come in, and each of you are probably going to have an opportunity at your life to talk to somebody about this, or maybe you'll notice it or something like that, especially as pastors and coming over groups of people. There's going to be people that have thoughts like this. And so the first thing you kind of want to try to figure out is this to the level of being clinically an issue? Is this fall in the OCD or the postpartum area? And if so, do I need to refer them to a doctor or a counselor to get help? One of the things about if it is in the category of actual OCD and not just intrusive thoughts, then medication really is pretty essential. And OCD is one of the most treatable disorders with medicine. And I wouldn't recommend just medicine. I think that therapy needs to be an important part of that process. But people who try to deal with OCD without using medication have a really difficult time in seeing a lot of success. Because a lot of that is stuff going on in their brain and chemical imbalance in their brain, and that needs to be helped. There's a psychiatrist in Greenville that I've referred a lot of people to who's really great with that, and he has seen a lot of success with Prozac with that, and depending on the severity, there's definitely different levels of severity. There's really mild, and then there's really severe, and with some of those clients who have really severe, they've had to do pretty high levels of Prozac, but it's made a huge difference. And I've had some parents of teens who struggle with this. They're really hesitant about their child being on medicine. And, we did therapy for a while without going to that level, and it just wasn't getting better. And we went to medicine and saw, all of a sudden now this teenager was able to have a healthy, normal lifestyle. So it made a huge difference. So the next step, once you've kind of decided what's going on there, is just educating and normalizing this for the people that you're talking to, helping them know that you're not alone. You're not the only person who feels this way. Sometimes helping them understand that sometimes we give thoughts too much weight. That whole idea of I think, therefore I am, that's a misbelief. That's not true. Just because I think this way doesn't mean that I am this type of person. And not every thought should be taken at face value. Just because I have a thought doesn't mean that I have to act on that. And in the article, there's a part where it says the problem in making a topic off limits is that your brain is always self-monitoring, trying to make sure that you're not thinking about it. And one example that I'll say to clients sometimes is if I said, okay, for the next 10 seconds, I don't want you to think about pink elephants. Think about anything but pink elephants, okay, but just don't think about that. And so then I'll count to 10 silently in my mind, and then I'll say, were you able to do it? Were you able to not think about pink elephants? And they're like, that's all I thought about the whole time. And so, so that's pretty much what we're asking people to do here with these intrusive thoughts. They're saying, I cannot think these thoughts about whatever this thing is. And that's all they think about. And so it's helping them not suppress or distract, but to give the thought radical acceptance and say, this is just a thought. It's just a thought. It does not define who I am. And so there is, let's see, when I was coming up in youth group, I remember our youth leaders talking to the guys about pornography and about impure thoughts and stuff like that. And an example that he gave that stuck with me was if you're walking down the street and you see an attractive girl who's talking to the guys, there could be a temptation to undress that girl in your mind, and so you can either choose to go with that and allow that to take place in your mind, or you can just let that thought just keep on going. It's like a bird that flies over your head. You can't help if a bird that flies over your head, but if you allow it to build a nest on your head, then you're responsible. And so I have really taken that to heart with this idea, because you can't help if this irrational thought comes to your mind, unwanted thought. You can't help if it just flies over. But it's when we grab that thought and say, oh, what would that be? What would that be like? Da, 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 and just build that up, then we are responsible. And so as a counselor, I'm teaching people ways to help them just take those thoughts captive and not make meaning of that, and just let them keep on going. And so that's part of that, is recognizing that this, as believers, that this is spiritual warfare. And for some people, clients that I have who are believers, we can say, did Satan put this thought in my mind, or is this thought just a thought that I came up with out of the blue? And in either case, we have the very power of God that we can call on and ask, in Jesus' name, I rebuke that thought. Get behind me, Satan. I rebuke you, if you're causing me to keep having these thoughts that I don't want to have. And so I think that's part of it. The other thing is just clinging to truth. When you're thinking about self-harm or those types of things, it's just reminding yourself that I'm a temple of the living God. I don't have a right to carry out those thoughts. I don't have a right to jump off a bridge, because he created me. He made me. I don't get to number my days. And so just clinging to that piece of truth and saying, that's not who I am. I'm not going to do that. It just allows it to keep on going. Let's see. So I feel like that bird analogy has helped a lot of clients to to just let thoughts just keep on passing and not just grab on hold of those. A licensed counselor, if you were to refer out beyond the tools that you could give them, they might use cognitive behavioral therapy to help them work through this, educating the client and normalizing, helping clients learn to dispute misbeliefs so that they can change the way that they feel and what they do. In cognitive behavioral therapy, we help clients realize that it's like ABC. So you've got A is the activating event. It's the thought that kind of comes in without our desire. The belief is what we tell ourselves about that thought. I must be, I'm a risk to society because I had this thought. If that's the belief that we have, then the C is the consequence, is how I feel and what I do. So if my belief is I'm a risk to society, then I'm going to feel anxious and I'm going to pull over on the side of the road, or I'm going to isolate, or I'm going to do these types of negative behaviors. And so if we think we've got to change having the thought in order to change how we feel, we don't have a whole lot of power. But if we think I have to change the way I believe about these thoughts to feel and act differently, then I do have some power there. And so that's where we come in and we try to say, that's just a thought. That's not who I am. I'm a child of God. I'm not going to do that. And then all of a sudden, that anxiety starts to dissipate, and we're able to move on and not do those harmful behaviors. So we're also, so that's kind of some of the tools that we provide clients with. And then helping clients determine if medication is necessary and making necessary referrals if that's something that is needed. So I put on here a couple of resources. The Psychology Today article, The Wicked Thoughts, is what you guys have, I believe. If someone is really dealing with clinical OCD and just wants to understand it better, there's a great book called The Boy Who Couldn't Stop Washing. And it's an older book, but it's about OCD. And it just helps people just see a lot of different examples of what that looks like and how it's played out and how people got healing. The Can Christianity Cure OCD is a book that has 3 different examples of Christians who lived before there was really treatment for this. And it's St. Therese, Paul Bunyan, and Martin Luther. And all of them struggled with OCD. And how they were able to transfer responsibility to God, because a big part about OCD is I'm responsible, and if I drop the ball, someone's going to get hurt. And to be able to transfer that to God and to say, God, you're responsible. You're going to keep me from carrying this out. I'm going to trust that you're going to keep our house safe, so I'm not going to check the doors again. I'm going to trust that you are going to take care of me, and that I'm not going to act out on some of these things. So there's that. And then there's a link to a fact sheet on scrupulosity. But there's also a movie some of you may have seen called As Good as It Gets that gives a great example of what life is like with OCD if you don't get treated. And so sometimes clients will watch that and realize, if I don't deal with this, my life is as good as it's going to get. But also don't want you guys to get caught up in OCD as being the root thing, because a lot of people who do not have OCD and do not need to be taking medicine and do not need to be seeing a doctor have unwanted thoughts. And that's really the main type of clients that you're going to be working with and talking to. And I just want you guys to be able to normalize that for them and help them make sense of that. So, any thoughts or questions?
Yes, so we're going to put the number up there. We had it up earlier. It'd be easy. Christy's getting all of those texts, and I'm going to go back, and Christy will just feed some questions to you as they come through. If you need to have more of a free-flowing discussion, it's fine. You can raise your hand, and I think Chris has another handheld. We'll get to you and let you ask a question. We're just recording because we want to have this resource for folks, especially as they come on our staff, or for us to go back to. So if you just be patient, wait on Chris, or Christy will have a mic over here. We can either feed questions to Kelly that way. I just was going to mention to you that in our leadership community, so I'm going to give you 2 examples, because for some of you who may not have been involved in shepherding, some of you know how much of this kind of thing we have going on. But within our leadership community, we had a woman who struggled with clinical OCD. I didn't know that. I'd known her a long time. And she got pregnant, and she had to go off some of the medication that she was taking. She might not have really had to go off it, but she was fearful that it was going to harm the baby. And when she did, she was late to a meeting where she and her husband were going to meet with me, because she had pulled off on the side of the road, and she was crawling around in the bushes because she was convinced that she had run over someone on the way to meet with me. This is in our leadership community here. Another woman who was in our leadership community who had not suffered any kind of childhood trauma or any kind of abuse, she was terrified that she was going to sexually abuse her children. So she would not bathe her children, but then the thoughts would become so rampant that she was fearful that she was going to abuse her children. This is graphic, and she would struggle. This is within our leadership community. She would struggle. She would go and masturbate so that she could know that she had not been aroused by her children, because the only way she could know as a checking behavior that she had not been aroused was if she was aroused. And you can imagine how devastating that would be. And she's awesome. Okay, so that's the extreme end of all of that. But what we're dealing with more, and y'all are dealing with, are folks who begin to have a thought and then they build a reality out of the thought. So I'm just saying to you, this is a real thing that we are dealing with as a church. And depending on your role, you're going to have different experiences of that, and it's got all these tentacles. So we got to be wise in how we deal with it. So if you have any questions, then send them in, or Chris can get to you. I think Christy already has a few, but I wonder if you might clarify for us. Can you go into a little more detail about how do we not stigmatize? Because if we think, like we have this when we get exposed to this, we become aware of it, then we could real quickly say, oh, well, that's just OCD, and this is what you need to go do, which could actually make the problem worse. So what kind of...
I would not even, I think, doing some calming, self-soothing things when you're having those thoughts rather than trying to make yourself not thinking about it. And trying to help people with that first. And I mean, just having someone say, you're not crazy, or no, that's not, just because you think about that doesn't mean that's something that you're gonna do. Even sharing the Wicked Thoughts article and helping people see that, oh wow, this is a thing. A lot of times, like, I'll talk to people and just say, oh, even just in telling a couple of people that I was doing this talk, somebody was like, oh, that's a thing? Oh my gosh, I have this all the time. Like, oh, I'm so relieved, and I was like, okay, like, so a lot of people are just, that's enough. That's all it takes, is just to realize that I'm not this closet, suicidal case or something like that. So I would say that's the first step. And then if it's not getting better and it seems to be escalating, I think a telltale thing is when you have these thoughts, what do you do to cope? If it's just kind of ruminating and all that kind of stuff, but if it starts to be something like what Bill was describing, I pull over on the side of the road, I'm checking the bushes, like that's taking it to another level, and in that type of situation, then it probably is more OCD.
All right, so we've got a couple of good questions coming in, but one, so what if a girl has thought about a girl being attractive or even has kissed a girl, now believes she is homosexual? Our generation seems to have thought and automatically wants to grasp onto a certain identity. How do you make her see that isn't her identity, and how do you help her process? And this is actually how you and I kind of came in to have this conversation, because I sent a girl to you. So can you kind of walk us through that?
So the question is if someone has actually acted on one of these thoughts.
Has had thoughts or has even kissed a girl.
And now they're just questioning their identity and wondering.
Right.
I think that, that one kind of is related to this, but it's a little bit different. But I feel like that, again, I would imagine that something like, even, I think when I've heard someone speak even just about the idea of having an affair or something like that, that whenever you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing, is kind of exciting. And so I think I read something where it was talking about that if you're having, or it may have even been one of, when we were doing the sex series at church, but you can't recreate. It's kind of like when you're watching a movie and it's like all of this crazy passionateness of somebody who just met a few minutes ago. You can't recreate that in day-to-day life. Not to say that there isn't passion and all of that kind of stuff. But so I think if somebody were to act on something like a girl kissing a girl, you're not supposed to be doing it. It might feel exciting. You might feel some feelings that, were pleasurable, but that doesn't mean that you are a homosexual. So I think, again, a thought is a thought, a feeling is a feeling. is this really the core of your identity? Are you going to base the core of your identity on something like that? So.
Yeah. And I think Gary and Melissa can even, in some of our sessions, help us with that. But we have two questions that are somewhat similar. So one was, how can we distinguish or help the person distinguish if and when a thought becomes sinful, especially around violent and sexually intrusive thoughts? And then another one asked about something similar. So how do you differentiate between the heart and the mind when Matthew 15:19 says evil thoughts come from the heart? Are evil thoughts fleeting and neutral, or rooted in our being sinners? So I think some of that goes to a brokenness of the body, and the fact that our bodies physiologically bear the curse. And so we have disease and we have death, and brokenness of the mind even is a part of that in mental illness. So how can you help distinguish between, okay, this person actually, there's something morally neutral but broken in them versus this is a sinful thought pattern that we need to help them correct? Does that question make sense?
Sort of. I think, when you think about having these thoughts, again, the whole bird analogy is it sinful for the bird that impure thought to fly into your head? If you did not summon it up, it just came out of the blue. That's where we've got to take that thought captive, rebuke that, choose to think about other things. And even just go to the Lord with that thought. Lord, I want to give you that thought back. That's something I don't want to dwell on. I don't want to think on. Are we going to sit there and really carry that thought out in our mind? So I think the issue and when people start to kind of get into obsessing about, I'm this terrible person because I have these thoughts, again, that's an identity thing. I think it also is kind of a thorn in the flesh. When we have a propensity towards something, and we want God to take it away, and I'm sure y'all will talk about this when you talk about same-sex attraction and stuff like that, and Peter Hubbard talks about that a lot in his book. That's, the idea of having a bent towards a type of sin or a type of behavior, just because we have a bent towards that, having a bent towards having these thoughts, that's something that we have to go to the Lord for day in and day out. It's like a thorn in the flesh. And so in the scripture where it talks about that he asked the thorn to be taken away, and God said, no, my grace is going to be sufficient for you. I think the same thing is true with these thoughts, is to say, okay, if these thoughts aren't going away and I'm rebuking them and I'm asking God to take it away, but I keep having these thoughts when I don't want them, that's just more opportunity for me to lean on the Lord and to say, okay, Lord, here I am again having these thoughts that I don't want to have, that I know that don't really honor you. Will you, lift me up and help me to resist the urge to really let those thoughts run rampant, and help me not to make meaning of that, and help me to cling to who you say I am and the identity that you've given me. And so I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. So another question is, can you give us kind of a difference between irrational thoughts or unwanted thoughts and versus kind of just anxious thoughts?
Anxious thoughts. Yeah. I would say anxious thoughts might be something like, oh gosh, what if my daughter, I hope my daughter makes it back to college safely. She hadn't texted me yet to say she's there. I hope she didn't get in a wreck. I hope she's okay. That's kind of like an anxious thought. Irrational thoughts are, I'm driving down the road and I could just swerve off right now and end my life. It's kind of almost like, what if I took control of the situation and took it to a bad place, as opposed to what if something completely out of my control took place, that would be more anxious. Even with the whole hand washing or door locking or those types of things, you know, those are more irrational. You know, what if someone broke in our house because I am not doing what I need to be doing. I'm not locking the door. I'm not washing my hands. I'm not sterilizing. That's more OCD, but when you just take it to the intrusive or wicked thoughts, what if I, you know, what if I was to just like lean forward and kiss this person I'm talking to or something like that? You know, that's an irrational thought. It's not like this accidental thing that could take place, so.
So we had another question. In your experience, are intrusive thoughts getting worse in our society? And what do you think are some of the root causes of intrusive thought, medical and non-medical?
I don't know if it's getting worse or not. I would imagine it's probably something that has been struggled with from the beginning of time. You know, Bill and I were talking beforehand about just the availability of information, you know, whether it's watching the news or watching, you know, news feeds on the internet and things like that, constantly being bombarded with these worst case scenarios. And, you know, if you watch the news, they are showing the one time that somebody broke in your house and raped everybody in the home, or the one time that, you know, all these, your worst fears actually like came true. And so I think that really feeds, you know, irrational thoughts for people because it's evidence it really happened. You know, like this person who, you know, stabbed their family members, and you're like, oh, man, like that does happen. The thing that I worry about actually happened, so now I'm really at risk, you know? Whereas before, maybe people didn't have access to that kind of information. I know I've had clients who have been really triggered by news stories like that. So.
Yeah, and we even had a young woman at our downtown campus who was convinced that she was going to be raped. And so we talked about the ongoing graphic, even just headlines. If you're not even reading the story, the headlines and some of that anxiety that can cause. But one more question. So as we are ministering to people, one of the things that you've talked about, shame and isolation. So, and I think shame and isolation breed all kinds of isms and sicknesses within us. So how can we, as ministers to others, create a safe environment for people to share some of these deepest, darkest thoughts in order to be able to get help?
Yeah. I think one time there was a training here and they were talking about, might have been community group training. They were talking about the question that follows the question that follows the question. Like it's not the initial question that's important, but it's all the ones that come behind. And I think that's kind of true in this kind of thing. You know, if somebody's talking about, you know, you're talking with someone in a community group or in a one-on-one setting and they're just talking about dealing with a lot of anxiety, you know, or they're talking about, I've been, you know, yeah, I just really don't get out much. I'm not, you know, or I didn't show up at that event. I thought you were going to come to this women's event or whatever, you know. And so it's kind of starting to kind of ask some questions. What was going on for you? You know, you tired? What was going on? Or, you know, starting to find out, well, I get really anxious at events like that. Oh, really? You know, when do you start to notice that you're getting really anxious? You know, and you're starting to create some safety, but you're asking some more questions and trying to understand what's going on here and giving some safety. And if they start to kind of test the waters with, you know, giving you a little bit of information, just really validating and normalizing that, oh, really? Yeah, a lot of people struggle with that. You know, there's a lot of people at our campus that have those kind of things. And so people are like, oh, okay. And, you know, they're waiting for that moment when you go, ooh, you know, I might need to get you some help for that, you know, like that's when they're like, shut down, you know, like, so I think that would be good.
All right, well, thank Kelly for being here and helping us out this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we Think about sources of evil. The Bible does not teach that all evil comes from the heart. The Bible talks about the world, the flesh, and the devil. All right? So there are things that, so for example, I had a babysitter who took advantage of me as a child. That's the world that's put on me, right? That's that's sin in the world that's put on me that creates some brokenness that's within me. That then makes me more susceptible, and it awakens certain things in my own brokenness that then I have to choose what to deal with. How am I going to deal with that? And then the devil's throwing fiery darts at me that I don't have anything to do with. They're getting launched at me. So sin can be structural. It can be as simple as me riding into work and a billboard creating discontent with my marriage, with my car, with whatever, with a radio advertisement. That's the world, structural evil that's outside of me, that then I have to choose, that can put an idea in my head. I have to choose what to do with that idea. And that's where Kelly's talking about taking every thought captive. But we do not ever want to think that every sin or every bad thought arises from the heart. So let's just make sure. The scriptures don't teach that. The scriptures have a much more nuanced understanding of subconscious, unconscious, not willful. And then you got to think about weakness and sin and brokenness. Those are helpful categories. Sometimes you're just tired. You're just weary. And that makes you, with your personality, with your strengths, makes you just more susceptible to certain things that you could never pin down. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're full of evil, right? And that something is wrong. So you got weakness, you have willful sin, and then you just have brokenness that you're always going to deal with. Our brokenness we're going to deal with until we're resurrected. Weakness is a part of our humanity. We have limitations, and this world that's broken wears us down. And then we also have sin that is a part of our identity. So the scriptures actually teach a really complex understanding of the human soul. And it's okay, right? So all of those things come together. And then there are certain folks that their neural pathways just don't connect properly. Just neurochemically, their brain's not right. And so we have to make sure that as a staff, we have a complicated understanding of how things work in people's hearts. And we don't always attribute everything immediately. This is a spiritual problem, and so you need to repent. The solution is not always repent. Sometimes it's just weakness that's got to be managed. Sometimes it's brokenness where you need fellowship and accountability. There's certain areas of my life that until I get new heavens, new earth, I'm just going to deal with it in a way that's different than the way Chad Clint deals with it. Does that make sense? And so we just want to make sure, and I just say that to you as a staff, we want to make sure that we have a nuanced understanding of that. If you don't feel equipped to have those kind of conversations, then that's the kind of thing you go to your staff supervisor. We can provide you with resources to help you have a more nuanced understanding of how all that works. All right? Because that's where a lot of shame comes out in religious context. That's why families like mine, where I have a brother who's severely mentally ill, who's disabled, who spends most of his time in his closet. He's 47 years old now. This month he'll be 47. And my folks are taking care of him. It's why families like mine don't go to most churches, because most churches don't have a sophisticated enough understanding of the brokenness and the weakness and the frailty of our humanity and how sin interacts with that, to be able to have space for people like my folks to feel comfortable being there. So most families who are dealing with mental illness, the way my family deals with it, they aren't in church. Because everything's got to be sin or a demon, or, then our whole system comes crashing down. But we want to make sure we have a better understanding of that. All right, so we're going to take a break. Restrooms, bathrooms, you know where they are. How long are we breaking? What's the schedule? I got it right here. All right. 10:45. All right, so take about 10 minutes.